We ended the last section on percentages by mentioning the M unit, which is really useful. It's another relative way of sizing things. It's named for the letter M. It historically was approximately the width of the letter M. It's spelled EM. I can just do that here. It's spelled like this. We'll be using plenty of these. But this is really the preferred way to define things like font sizes, right?
Right. And the way that it works is that when you see one written, like if we change this H2 that's in the CSS from 30 pixels to, let's say, 2M, that 2M is actually a percentage. So in the last section, we were talking about how percentages were like M's, and this is why. So that's saying 200%. And what that's basing the size off of is the parent container. So if the parent container has a font size set, then it'll use that font size and then it'll double it because we said 2M, so 200%. But if that parent container doesn't have a font size set, then it looks up one more parent container and then one more. And ultimately, if no font size is set, it'll get to the HTML element. And if nothing is set there, it'll use the browser default font size, which happens to be 16 pixels. Okay, so in this case, because we have nothing set, it's actually 30. It's the equivalent of 32 pixels. So if Michael changes this to 32,
yeah, it should be exactly the same.
Yep.
Oh, look at that.
So it's relative in that it's based off of a parent container, but ultimately deep down there is actually still an absolute value somewhere. So it's kind of funny when people say that, oh, never use absolute things. It's everything is kind of absolute, but just not always directly.
All right, the example in the text we have is biocopy. We change just this font size here. So let's try that out. We actually don't have a CSS rule for that yet, do we?
Nope.
We have one for the link, but not for the text. And we can use half an M, so 0.5 M. And what is that going to give us here? Let's take a look.
It's going to make very small font.
Just tiny. So that is. So why is it so small?
It's so small because right now that is 50% of the browser default, which is 16 pixels. So that's the equivalent of 8 pixels in height, which is unreadably small.
Right, but we can change the font for the wrapper by going to this bio wrapper that we left empty at the end of the last section. So we've got, let's say, make this 24 pixels. Oops, 24. And so then this will be 12, is that right?
Correct.
So this is going to be 24 is the wrapper, and then half of that should be 12 pixels.
Exactly.
Still pretty small, but not quite as tiny.
Right. So one thing that's really important here is that these values are cumulative. So what that means is that if you have an M sizing that looks to a parent and there's another M sizing there, it will look up to the next parent and then filter everything down. And that can create situations where you have really, really huge font or really, really small font because each one of those steps can be multiplicative. So we'll do an example of that here where what we'll do is we'll set the BioBox font size. So this is the parent container for biocopy.
Right, so this is here.
So if we set that to font size 0.5 M, what that does is now the parent of biocopy will have 12 pixels, which makes biocopy half of that, so 6 pixels, which will be absolutely tiny.
So we'll take a look at this. Yeah, that's really small.
Right, and so this goes the other direction too, where if we were to change these to be enlarging the font, so 1.5 instead of just 0.5, we would get absolutely gigantic font. So this is a thing that you really have to be careful with.
Yeah.
With relative font sizes, because it can get out of control really fast.
Yeah.
So if you're designing modules that are going to be placed into other places on the site, you need to be aware of how your fonts are being styled, because let's say you have something that's all relative and you drop it into a spot on the site that has, 0.5 em, well then everything inside your module that you just made is going to shrink down really tiny, like maybe
Right.
way more than you expect.
This is also a good example of how it's nice to organize your CSS like this. You can see we have all our bio styles in one space here, and so we can look at this and say, well, this is 1.5 em. Well, 1.5 of what? Well, it's 1.5 of the bio box, which is 1.5 em, and then we can go up to the bio wrapper. So because they're right next to each other in the file, we can calculate it more easily.
Right. And so in this case, like, you might also be wondering, well, why use these relative fonts? And the answer is that it's actually nice for when you're changing your styles. So if you're making something that is adapting to fit between a desktop and a mobile device, you can make changes to the styles, and we'll talk about this later in later sections. But you can insert changes so that on a mobile device, you can change, let's say, the bio wrapper's font size.
Mm-hmm.
And if everything is relative to the font size of the bio wrapper,
Yeah.
then you only have to change one number, and suddenly
Right.
it looks great on mobile, or looks great on desktop.
Yeah, that's really convenient.
Right.
All right, well, for now, we're going to make this just 1em. And are we keeping the other ones the same? It looks a little big. All right, let's also change this font size here in the bio box to 1em. There we go, and that looks a little better.
Yep. We'll be changing that in the next section anyways, and editing these font sizes. So this isn't going to be permanent. So we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that this value, the em value, can be used for things that aren't fonts. So you can use them to size any element on the page. You can set margins, you can set widths, you can set heights. You can use it for whatever you want. But it's a little tricky, because what you're basically using as the basis of your sizing for these elements is the line height. So remember that em is changing the size of font. So if you're setting a width of like a padding, like in this image, you're basing it off the height of the font, which is a little bit weird.
Yeah, that's strange.
But once you get used to it, the idea here, and the reason why you might want to use this, is that if you're changing the size of your font, you also might want the margins within elements or padding to change in proportion to the font. But at the same time, the caveat here is that there are also times where you might not want that. You might just want to have the font change and then use absolute sizing like pixels or some other values that we'll talk about in a little bit, so that just the font changes, and then you don't have your elements on the page moving around in height or padding or margin. So it can be used for those things. Some people definitely do use that. You'll see it. And especially people who are anti-pixel fundamentalists will say, of course you got to do this. But to me, it's one of those things where it's like, I need to consider how I want this page to respond to changes in the browser, changes in usage. It's more complicated, is basically what I'm getting at.
Okay. Yeah, definitely holy war territory here. But it seems like, as usual, it's a matter of judgment.
Exactly. Cool. And such wonderful holy warriors that we have here. They truly look like fine specimens. martial prowess on here.
That's right. All right, well, ems are certainly useful, but there are some times where we want to have a sort of a more absolute way of doing a similar thing, right?
Right, but still be relative.
Okay. Well, so let's take a look at that in our next section.
Right.